We'll jump into today's episode right after this announcement. For over 13 years, something remarkable has been happening. Rural hospitals and other small healthcare organizations that have partnered with Capstone have been achieving results and forming workplace cultures that even we are blown away by. It is truly a game changer when rural hospitals are the provider of choice and employer of choice so they can keep care local and margins strong. Far more healthcare organizations need to experience what's possible. That's why we're stepping forward in a bigger way, expanding our team of experts, expanding our capabilities by adding a strategic planning division to expand our ability to help even more rural hospitals and other healthcare organizations in 2026 and beyond. Capstone will continue to be the partner that small healthcare organizations can count on to meet them where they're at and guide them towards a stronger future. You can learn more at capstoneleadership.net.
The science of security is continuing to evolve. And I think what we're trying to do is be a part of bringing that to the forefront. And it's exciting times. It's never been more essential. I would say it's also never been harder to be successful in the security space.
Welcome to Culture Change RX, the podcast for healthcare professionals that are committed to creating a thriving workplace culture, improving the experiences of employees and patients, and ultimately unlocking their organization's next level of potential. I'm Sue Tetzlaff, your host and co-founder of Capstone Leadership Solutions. Join me and my insightful guests each week as we share actionable insights for navigating the crucial people side of the business of healthcare. Subscribe now for a weekly dose of Culture Change RX. Now let's dive into this week's conversation where culture change takes center stage.
Welcome to another episode of Culture Change RX. It is me, Sue Tetzlaff, the host of the show and co-founder of Capstone Leadership Solutions. And I have with me a guest in the studio today. It is Tony York. And I'm going to start, as usual, with guests and have him introduce himself, his company, and what he's been up to a little bit. And then we're going to get into a conversation that we have planned today around the topic of safety and security in a healthcare environment. So welcome to the show, Tony.
Hey, thanks, Sue. It's a pleasure to be here with you. You know, it's an interesting topic that we're jumping into. One that when I first started my career back in the very early 90s, people were like, hey, Tony, what are you doing? What do you mean? Healthcare's not safe? What they need security? It's been an interesting ride to see the evolution of systems and how we're now trying to do everything we can to keep this environment safe.
Mm-hmm. So the company that you're working for now, is that the company you've been with the entire time in your career, or have you been some other places as you focused on safety and security?
Yeah, I'm with the Paladin Security Group now, and I joined them right in the heart of COVID, which was not the ideal time to go be a part of a new organization. But they were really doing a lot of security, especially in the healthcare environment, coast to coast in Canada, and had said, we really want to jump into the deep end inside of the U.S. Security market. And I had partnered with their former COO to write the last textbook, Hospital and Healthcare Security, and its 6th edition. But to your specific question, I spent 25 years working for what was considered by many the original shared service in healthcare, Hospital Shared Services of Colorado, where we had the opportunity to see healthcare delivered from some of the largest level 1 safety net hospitals to community healthcare facilities that were having single beds that were designed and designated for emergencies, and a lot of specialty care facilities in between and all kinds of environment. It was a great experience, a great organization, and something I lean on heavily now in everything that I do.
Yeah. In fact, you mentioned Colorado. That's where I learned about you. One of your colleagues was there at a Colorado Hospital Association event that I was speaking at, and I met him during some of the networking there, and we started talking about your company and the work that you're doing there. And I loved, the conversation we had. And I said, wow, this is a great topic for a podcast on culture change, which is really about the people side of healthcare and keeping our environments and our workplaces safe for both patients and staff is obviously, important topic about the culture, a safe workplace. So yeah, and right away he says, I know who you need to talk to. You need to talk to Tony. So I'm glad we've been able to meet each other, and now we're here for today's conversation. You mentioned about, starting this in the early 90s in this work and this specialty in this work. What have you seen as major things that have changed in this work or in the environments over the time, if you were to contrast now to about 10, 20 years ago?
That's such a great question. I've actually wrote a little bit about the evolution of healthcare security and how it's changed. And a lot of times the association I'm pretty heavily involved with, the International Association for Healthcare Security and Safety, the local chapters will ask me to come and speak to them about this very topic. And what's so interesting is when I first started, people were like, why are you doing it? I alluded to that. But then all of a sudden, and we were already seeing volatility inside of healthcare, but healthcare was being asked to do more with less. About that time, Sue, we were starting to see disruptive behavior really starting to present itself. But there were two things that were happening at that moment. One, we were all trying to right size and really be as smart as we can in our budgetary thinking. And that really meant we lost something that were the orderlies that were historically very much next to bedside and really supporting care in a way that today security is asked to do a lot of. And so that was one driver. The second driver was really the inability or the lack of resources that were really funding mental health. And what that required was we started seeing a reduction in the total amount of inpatient beds. And that put a lot more inside the emergency room and other areas of the care environment that really weren't designated or designed for that type of treatment. And as a result, we started seeing demand for security really drop. That started in the 90s, and it's as apparent today as it was then, and probably more thought of because we're reporting on it. There's more frameworks. Our accrediting bodies are saying, hey, do something more about it. And I really believe the reason for that is the important piece of this. Security shouldn't be about just guards, gates, and guns. And it really needs to be about, hey, what are we doing for the well-being of our staff? What are we doing for a better patient experience? And recognizing that the security program, the protection program should be there to accentuate that, create a therapeutic environment so care can be rendered safely, not just creating a security state, as some people like to refer to some of the work that we do. But what else changed during the midst of all of this, Sue? 9/11 changed the whole landscape. The word security came off the tongue in a whole different context, and it's still omnipresent. I mean, who would have thought that we would look at what goes on when we go through the airports and get screened as just becoming commonplace? We're seeing that same trend, although in the earliest of stages, starting to influence healthcare as we start trying to think, are we screening? Are we having interactions with our visitors and not keeping our open doors, which many initially were thinking, this isn't going to be good. And in fact, our communities are saying what? Thank you. We really appreciate you giving consideration. Our care providers, our ancillary staff are saying, oh, thank you for doing something because we were having concerns. And candidly, what people carry on their person in society is a bit surprising. It would alarm some to see what we see because the number of weapons that we do pull off of folks, maybe not just firearms, I don't want to use that, but edged weapons and things that just are carried on the person that can harm themselves or harm somebody else, especially when they're in such a heightened state and emotions are running real high. But changes happen. The other thing that I would share with you is 21 years ago this year was Katrina. And Katrina taught us about emergency management. And so we started seeing the intersection of what's business continuity, and how do all of this thinking preparation now start being forethought and saying, how does that change the dynamic of how do we keep these environments safe, and not just looking at it as a person, but as a program that's keeping these environments safe. And I think those have made major changes. I could go on for probably the next 25 minutes, but I'll just stop there for a second.
Those are some great examples. When you talked about the loss of our orderlies, I've been in healthcare long enough to remember when that was a vital member of our team. And you're right, they did have a role that really impacted our sense of safety and security in the care environments for sure. And I wouldn't have picked that one out there, but I'm so glad you mentioned it because it really hits home with me. And, I contrast too, like I've been in healthcare since the early 90s. And, I think about how things worked and what I saw. And, now since I'm in this work of improving healthcare environments as far as the care, the workplace, the employee experience, the patient experience, and I assess it all the time. I'm watching all the time. I can't turn it off. And a couple situations recently, I'll just mention, that's so different that wouldn't have happened in the 1990s or maybe even 10 years ago is I was calling to make an appointment and with a healthcare provider for an imaging exam. And before I even got to talk to a scheduler, there was an automated message about the expectation for my civil behavior during this interaction and how the call could be ended if I didn't uphold that. And then I took my dad to a cardiology appointment just yesterday afternoon. And in the waiting room was a big sign about the expectations for the civil behavior of in the treatment, the kind treatment of the healthcare workers by the patients and family members. So those are things that I would not have seen or heard probably even 5 or 10 years ago, which is just speaking to some of the things that we know are these changes that have been happening over decades and have gotten us to this point of maybe some more proactive and, in the moment reminders about behavior. Pausing here to get healthcare executives excited about Capstone's 14th annual Healthcare Executive Forum. Many small and rural healthcare organizations are operating under conditions that naturally strain margins, workforce stability, and long-term competitiveness. Strength today requires more than perseverance. It requires intentional design and doing. And that's why the focus of our Healthcare Executive Forum this year is on designing the future. It's all about where strategic clarity meets execution certainty. This isn't just another conference or networking event. This is where rural healthcare executives learn how to lead their organizations to true organizational vitality. If your plan or your ability to execute it is in question, if progress feels incremental instead of transformational, it may be time for a trajectory-changing strategic period. Be a leader in rural healthcare's new era, the era of organizational vitality. Register now and bring your executive team. It is true that the next 3 years may be the most defining period your organization has faced in decades. Visit capstoneleadership.net and click on upcoming events. See you in June in Madison.
Psychologically, they're deterrents. And we're trying to create psychological safety for so many that we're walking in the halls. But we're also trying to set that expectation of what's your behavior? And let's face it, that when we talk about violence and some of the disruptive behaviors, I think sometimes we naturally sort of gravitate towards people are intentional with this. A lot of things that we're dealing with in healthcare, whether it's in the emergency department, in the ICU, general med surge, volatility is happening everywhere, but it's not necessarily intentional. A lot of it is unintentional. Someone had a closed head injury. Someone is having a behavioral health crisis. Someone just lost a loved one, and the emotional turmoil that they're facing just was too much for them in the moment. So we want to try to give that space for grace, but we also want to let folks know that we have people who are caring for them. And so we're trying to set an expectation that, hey, that's not acceptable here, that that's not tolerable. And I feel like that's
Mhm.
also what we're saying to our staff members as entities, that we are really thinking about them and their well being and how we're now managing this culture of safety and saying everybody's a part of it. It's not just a security concern, it's all of us being a part of creating these layers of protection. And those words, I like to call them low cost and no cost. With so much of what we do in our space,
Yeah.
we're people intensive as security. We do use a lot of technology. We do have things that do have heavy price tags. So we always want to find and strike those balances to really keep these environments so that folks feel like, hey, you know what? I don't have to worry about my safety, so I can worry about my role. I can worry about caring for my loved one. I can worry about my healing. And that's what we're trying to manage. And so that we're finding that balance so that people aren't feeling like, oh man, am I going to have an issue here? No, it's a matter of be there so that you can get the services that you rendered. That's why we want security to be somewhat in the walls, but in the same vein, we want to create enough objectivity towards, hey, what are those expectations and how do we address someone who may be loud and boisterous? Why? Because they just had a really horrible diagnosis that was provided to them, and they're they're mourning that situation. And at the same time, how do we find that and strike that balance and saying, well, maybe we need to have a room so that they can do that and do that with peace and do that where they're not disrupting others and making them concerned. The balancing is really important. And I think that's really how healthcare security is starting to really be connected to the much broader mission of care. And I think that's important, not only to me as the self-proclaimed healthcare security nerd on the other side, but to all of my colleagues that are really trying to say, hey, let's professionalize this space.
Yeah, yeah. That's just a good point to emphasize. I'm curious about just a process geek. So I'm really curious about an organization that recognizes that they might have some risk and they want some outside help or guidance. Or maybe they just realize that it's time to make some formal efforts in this regard. I know in my workplace years ago when the topic of this would come up, it almost seemed like it had a employee route to it. We had unions in our healthcare environment. It seemed like it was on the table of the labor management meetings about safety of workers and really bringing that forward to leadership to say, hey, can we look at this? Can we have some solutions to this? It could have been as simple as, a better light in the employee parking lot for the nighttime workers and those kind of things. But it seemed like, but if an organization, is looking to, evaluate their current risks and concerns and seek some expert guidance, what kind of process does that look like? It might be different for different organizations, but for your company, is there kind of a normal process or an expected process that's used?
Yeah, what a great question, Sue. And it's somewhat multifaceted. Let me start by thinking about it as general industry, and I'll sort of turn you into what we like to do here with
Okay.
Empowered and Empower American. And, if I was to advise someone, you're thinking you need some help, you want a guide on this journey to say, hey, how am I reading these healthcare security waters and how do I best really start navigating? I would say start first by saying, what's a qualified healthcare security professional and who is that?
Mhm.
There's a credential in our industry that we call the Certified Healthcare Protection Administrator, CHPA is how that's shortened. And that's really someone who's going that extra effort to say, I'm learning all that I can about healthcare security. I'm learning about leadership and how it interfaces with emergency management and safety and really creating that. And so that's a very detailed process. And so I would expect and hope that someone has that type of individual working with them. And that's what we like to do. Now, when I'm thinking about this and somebody says, hey, Tony, help me start from scratch. I know what I don't know, so please. And I say, look, let's think about it in this way: people, process, and technology. So we're going to start in that big, broad bucket. And then we're going to say, let's look at our security department operations. What's your program? What's design? As important as anything, Sue, let's just ask ourselves this. Do we have the right expectations? Do we know what metrics that are mattering the most to us so that we are able to say, here's what my expectations are and here's how I know I'm achieving those? And that really starts saying what kind of outcomes we want, perceptions that we're trying to create and harvest inside of our employees, but also our patients and visitors and everybody who interacts with us. But when we start getting into those operations, we're trying to really look at, I haven't met a security practitioner yet that says I have enough security personnel. So I think every one of your listeners, and I know I see it, and it doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means that sometimes we've got to look at it and say, all right, we do have to do more with less. So how do we do that? So we have to look at the training that they're provided and think about, are those expectations clearly articulated, and are they meeting our desires for how we want our people who do wear the uniform of security to show up and interface and to really set the example for what it's like to be here. Because let's face it, a lot of times these same individuals are the first people folks see and the last. So I think it's important. But the governance documents that have a part of what they're doing, I could go into a really deep level of detail, but I'll just say in short, post order, standing operating procedures, just to try to maintain this mindset. Am I really trying to do a service and proactive function? Or am I really trying and prevent things from happening and be a visible deterrent? Or am I trying to stop it when I see it and be a much more, let me catch you if I can? That has a little bit of a law enforcement flavor, I know. And I think what we're trying to do right now is strike the proper balance inside of care of saying, well, how do we build that protection system in the right manner? Because for the most part, 90% should be service oriented, helping create an environment, standing by with a care provider who may be dealing with someone who gives them a little bit of a hair on the back of the neck raised and say, I might want to have somebody be here in case something happens. We want that. Standing by and being there. I've used therapeutic a few times, but taking considerations of the trauma someone may have been exposed to in their past and how that might need to be given consideration for what they're dealing with now. We don't know everyone's story, so we have to give them that grace to be able to say, okay, as long as they're not going too far, there's always a line that we all have to understand. But then the last piece here, Sue, is what do we do with technology? Technology, some people say, oh, it ought to be able to, supplement the people. It accentuates the people. We can see more our technology. When I said 9/11 earlier about what's changed, oh my goodness, has this been an area of great investment by the manufacturers? The technology, the innovations here have just been wildly just eye-opening, from AI-enabled video surveillance that can help bring attention to us when something's happened and it says, oh, this occurred, pay attention, to what we're seeing in weapons detection, to just the basics of access control so I can know who's coming. But frankly speaking, the worst situations happen. We got a big patient surge. I can secure, or we can get this environment in a place that we know who's coming and going in a very quickened state. All of that comes at different fundamental stages, and there is a maturity level within healthcare security that everyone has. The leaders are the ones who are driving a lot of that, and a lot of that is where they're at on their journey. How important is it? Where's our risk tolerances as leaders to the things that are happening? We can't stop everything from happening, but I will say we're a little bit in the business of, we're trying to keep things from happening. And I say to people all the time, security, we're in the business of making nothing happening. And just because something didn't happen doesn't mean it wasn't going to, and that our mitigations weren't effective. And so it's a balancing act between, where our investment dollars are at. Oh, and nothing's happened. We haven't had these reportable events. And now, well, maybe we can get away with a little less. And that's always the delicate balance of where someone should start. But getting that started, that conversation is such an important piece.
Yeah, such a great description about that entire package of process, people, and technology. When you mentioned, security present in my community hospital, I remember when that wasn't so. And then, I remember when that was added and then access control. When you mentioned access control, it sparked me to remember that early in my career, probably the only doors that were locked were right to the OR proper. And it wasn't for security, it was for infection control.
That's right.
It wasn't
That's
for
right.
security. And then when I think about now walking into the hospital where I worked for over two decades, yeah, there's access control to the ED, there's access control to certain doors at night that are locked down, to the obstetrics unit, which wasn't locked down before. I mean, there's just so many areas now that access control. So, yeah, and that changes workflow too, right?
Yes.
So we're all impacted by that. It creates another step in our work to get things done. And sometimes it can seem frustrating, like, yes is for the cause of safety, but now I have one more step to take to even access the emergency department as a phlebotomist to get in there to do my work. So yeah, it's a holistic view. And that's what I hear you saying. So one thing I was thinking about too is that a thing that I thought was a game changer in healthcare environments that really I thought had a big impact on security and safety was we started daily safety briefings, but we did them more around patient safety, patient risk, like patients are at risk because this technology isn't working or this supply is in short supply or whatever. What it really started to do is create a daily rhythm or cadence of awareness and vigilance. So if you knew you had to report for, the area of the organization you were responsible about, maybe something that happened or risks that occurred in the last 24 hours and what you see as a possible risk in the next 24 hours. What I saw was that security and conversation around that started to be more and more some of the things that were offered up for employee safety and security as well as patient visitors. So I think that's a big step. And again, that's not costly.
Exactly.
That's, 9 to 12 minutes a day of leadership, but it's the 24 hours in between there where their eyes are open in a new way and aware and vigilant in a new way, that safety and security is top of mind.
It's communication and the openness of that
Yeah.
communication. And now we're not working in silos. We're working as we all have a need to understand what's happening in the environment. We may not be disclosing, I don't think anyone's disclosing anything that they shouldn't, but think about the security team now is getting access to who's got a safety plan. And maybe they're in the ICU and we wouldn't, but what do we now need to do to know? One, we got to call support and be expedient, maybe give a little few more patrols or do the standby. Whatever the need may be, because that opens up the door. And candidly, Sue, I mean, I agree with your no cost, low cost kind of mentality, but what is it also doing? We're fixing things faster. They're not festering. They're actually
for
being
sure.
addressed. And the expectation, I think, healthcare has now created is where we can, let's fix this in the next 24 hours and we'll report back. And then people see, oh, I report something happened to it. And whether they're reporting it in that huddle or that briefing or they're doing it with their proxy, it's amazing how that's flowing. And now people are like, oh, they do care about me. All I had to do was bring it to their attention. And I think that's why we're going to see more and more reporting of workplace violence events, why that's going to be, I think, very powerful. I do think we have to be mindful of one thing on that front. I think it's going to appear to all of us that we have a very big spike in reportable events of violence. I think some of that's real, and I think some of it's going to be because of the mindset that we're changing.
Yeah.
Folks are going to be more comfortable reporting because we're doing things about it, and as a result, what happens? We're going to get more of it. I don't know if more is happening, but it's going to feel like it. And so for organizations that are saying, oh, I want to reduce my total number of events of violence, they may feel like they are going up a hill as opposed to seeing the reductions. And I just think it's important that we recognize, because we've had there's been a culture of tolerance towards volatility and violence. And so communicating and sharing Whether it was deserved or not, I don't think it was, but it's been omnipresent. And I think we've broken through. And I think that's a big cultural shift that we're taking inside of healthcare. And I think both of those are really going to be a big impact. But, Sue, all of that was doing what else happens in that daily safety huddle? There's an executive who's present, who's showing that they care about this. And that's one of the things that I'm seeing right now that is another huge change. Executive interest inside of how do we take care of our people? And the balance was, and even if you look back and when we first started, remember Joint Commission's Plant Technology and Safety, first time security was ever discussed in any regulatory bodies. And if you look at the literature of the time, you'll see everything was about patient safety. Heck, even then, they were talking about staff violence against a patient, not patient violence against the staff. And so what's really happened now is we haven't changed as much as we have found a balance to say, yes, we're always going to be patient-centric. Their safety is at the heart of what we do. But to deliver on that, we have to keep our staff members safe. And I feel like that, even in our regulatory bodies, we're starting to see the change, see the impact that that's having. And I think that's helping those that are delivering care at the bedside, in the surgical suite, wherever, say, I can do this now smarter. Whether that's through training, whether that's through the built environment, whether that's through the people that wear the uniform, all of that is making this program that's really establishing a safer healthcare. And I think that's where we're trying to get to.
Yeah. Really also this mindset and shift that you're talking about is that it is everybody's job, right?
Yes.
Like we all have to be aware. We have to know what we can do. It can happen in a split second, like you mentioned. I remember a nurse that worked for me, she got teeth knocked out from a very tiny, little old lady with dementia, and she was strong enough and just in a split second to take out the teeth of a very experienced nurse of mine. And it happened in a split second. And I don't know, possibly if she could have, known ways to mitigate that risk or protect herself. But, it's really something that as organizations, just having technology, just having a show of presence of security, they can't be everywhere, every second, every day. And that, they can help us learn how to help ourselves and to mitigate our own risk if at all possible.
You're 100% correct. We can't have enough security people, so we all have to take our personal accountabilities and responsibilities to it. And I think as healthcare delivery, what we've learned is what's our obligation to train? And, in bringing awareness to the disruptive behavior, the aggression that happens. Sue, if you really look right now in nursing school, very limited amount of discussion about aggression. I've talked to quite a few nursing school leaders, and each have a very similar response to why not. They're afraid that people will learn that and not enter the field in the first place. So it's a protection in its own right to do that. And I say that because that's why as healthcare, we have that obligation to give them that level of knowledge. You talk to our friends who've been through medical school, they don't talk about this with any level of ability to say, here's how you manage in this situation. And candidly, if I was to say the evolution of healthcare, MHAs and MBAs, they're not getting exposure to this type of risk management. And I understand there's only so much curricula you can cover, but I think one of the things that we want to do is try to say, how do we help them be smarter about that? I mentioned I was able to be a part of writing Hospital and Healthcare Security, and I just released 7th edition here just a couple weeks ago. But the very last chapter is written to this very topic, the basic primer for healthcare executives. It's written for rhetorical, what questions should I be asking as a leader, not the practitioner delivering, but the leader for my expectations and what should I have, and helping them try to be best armed for just thinking about what are those questions? What are the things I ought to be giving consideration to? It's not exhaustive by any stretch, but in the same vein, I think it's designed to really help them have a clearer picture for something that, unless they've had a really negative experience or a really good teacher along the way, there's no other way to really learn this. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have as a profession, is to say, how can we help fill that gap and fill that knowledge void? Because our leaders in healthcare right now are seeing security and protection as more central than ever before. And I think now it's a matter of how do we help them make the best decisions, because they know what they should do. They don't always know what to do. And I feel like that's the
Exactly.
balance that we're trying to find.
And that can be frustrating, to
Sure.
feel this sense of responsibility and a need to do something and not even know where to start. So that's fantastic. Our time together, I told you 30 minutes would go by fast, and it always does. So as we wrap up though today for our time together, is there any topic in particular or issue that you just want to make sure gets included?
Thanks for that too. And my passion for the space is, without question, I really love helping other people understand what are the challenges and how to solve them. We've talked a lot about the safety of the staff. We've talked a lot about the safety of the patients and everyone that experiences us on the delivery side. I just want those that are out here listening is to not lose sight of their own personal safety. Executive protection has become something that is really important, that has been highlighted by some egregious events that we've seen now. And I think we all have to be mindful of, we're not immune. And as individuals, as individual facilities, violence and disruptive behavior, the incivilities that are happening in society, they're infiltrating our environments as well. So what do we need to do is try to be prepared and think about things in manner as not just adding more people, but adding the systems and the mitigations that really are effective. The IHSS is the International Association for Healthcare Security and Safety. If you have a leader that is providing that protection program and giving oversight, they should be a member. The executive that has oversight should be a member. They should be taking a curious approach to what's going on, not because they need to know everything, but they at least know that there's resources and what is the evidence showing to us that's happening. The firm I represent, we are one element. We do specialize in healthcare security. Paladin and Pal American, this is our space. This is what we really, really know, and we take great pride in that. In the same vein, if we can provide and help people with those that wear the uniform, or we consult and help those that say, hey, we're not certain what our model should be, but we know that we want to do something a little differently. And we know we have a budget that we have to be within. How do we make the best strategic resourcing decisions that we can? Those are the kinds of things that I think we want to have. And that includes the built environment, Sue. I alluded to that just so briefly, but the built environment is something those of us in the industry have been spending a lot more time with the architects, the building planners, and the design engineers to start thinking about how can we save by really being thoughtful about the renovation and the greenfield projects that we're bringing up, and layering in security, not about just where cameras are placed and doors are locked. It's the whole concept of how we want flow to go inside the organization and what specialty concerns we ought to have, whether they're in a pharmacy or a mother-baby unit or a designated mental health unit or any of the likes, to just include you talked about earlier, the lighting inside of a facility. Well, there's standards that we should be applying to that. There should be ways that we create that psychological safety that actually does show our teams, hey, we care about their safeness. And it also tells those that are maybe thinking about doing harm, security's taken with importance here. If you want to do harm, go elsewhere where it may not be. But we're taking it. We're going to harden our target in a smarter way. But do that through proper design, not security state, but a way that can be done. And I think all of that can be achieved while we maintain openness, welcoming, and security. It doesn't have to be, convenience and security are two ends of the polar end of the opposites. We can bring it all together and say, We can get this. And I think that's what I would encourage the audience out there.
Mhm.
The science of security is continuing to evolve. And I think what we're trying to do is be a part of bringing that to the forefront. And it's exciting times. It's never been more essential. I would say it's also never been harder to be successful in the security space because we're dealing with a lot of people who have their opinion about how security ought to be
Mhm.
delivered, and they're not, and they have expectations that may be founded in some, I have to say, they're unfounded. They're not quite based in logic. They're based in what they think they saw on TV, and we can create it. And let's face it, there's a lot of great things that we can do, but it takes thoughtful, purposeful, strategic approaches, not just sitting there saying, we had an event, how fast can we make this happen? And to my security
Mhm.
professional friends that are out there, when that day and that question happens, that's when we have to do our assessments. We have to have our plan. Doesn't mean they get approved in the moment, but we have them ready in case there's something that happens. And we now know if we were saying we got to do something and do it quick, we have the plan, and all we got to do is say, here's what we would think we should do. So it's not waiting and just reacting. There is a large expectation of being proactive in what we're trying to accomplish.
Mhm. Yeah, we are big proponents in our company and our work with proactivity. And yes, there's going to be these times where we have to react to an incident and reevaluate our plans, et cetera, and maybe craft some new ones. But that proactivity you mentioned, even with building, it's way easier to bake it in the beginning than try to retrofit later. It's never optimal, I think, when we try to retrofit it later. I think one of my experience with that was actually being an executive lead on a new inpatient locked psychiatric unit. Talk about baking in the safety and security for everyone in there and being very proactive about that in the design and every feature to the beds and the
Hmm?
furniture and all of that and things you wouldn't think of related to safety. So you're right. The science is always improving in every area of healthcare, including keeping it safe. So where can people reach you, your company, your book, get your book? Sounds like a fabulous resource beyond just for other people in the space of security.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so look up Tony W. York on LinkedIn, and you'll probably see my smiling face and a little bit of background with a healthcare security nomenclature. PaladinSecurity.com or PalAmerican.com, based if you're Canadian or U.S. We do have both are very well connected, and our approaches to what we're trying to accomplish in healthcare is important. And then I'm going to replug the IHSS, iahss.org. For those that want to just know and see, I know I give back a lot, but I've gotten so much more than I ever have given. It's a wealth of information, guidelines, research. There's just information that I would just say our space loves to share. We take our
Hmm.
work very seriously, but we don't try to hide it from each other. We try to build off of it and be learning organizations. For those that are interested, the IHSS has a big annual conference coming up in New Orleans. I'll be doing a pre-conference session for those that are new, those executives that are just now obtaining oversight. It's a 4-hour pre-conference, but it's one that we talk about the basic elements of healthcare security management. And Sue, those are
When is
programs.
that, Tony?
That'll be in mid-April, April
Mid-April.
12th. So yes, and
Okay.
so it's a fun
Great.
program. I think it's really designed for those that want to say, "Hey, help me make certain I got my fundamentals right, my nuts and bolts correct." So it's
Yeah.
and I've been teaching this one in various fashions for 20 years now. I love helping folks just understand how and to feel success. So it's a wonderful
Yeah.
opportunity they
Great.
provided.
I'm going to put links to all of this in the show notes as well, and a link for your book to get your book. So the latest
Yeah.
edition
Yeah,
is
the
now out there.
7th edition, you can find it on Amazon. You can find it with the publisher Elsevier. Look up Hospital and Healthcare Security, 7th edition. First time I actually went after it alone after being a co-author with some really great folks over the last 2 editions, honoring the tradition that my mentor and who started this tradition, and a gentleman by the name of Russ Colling, who is a patriarch in our space, and it's been an honor to carry that forward. But it's I think, as Russ would say, well, Tony, the book keeps getting bigger and the pages keep getting longer, and I keep adding more than I'm probably subtracting. So it's but that's just the nature of the changes in our space. But hopefully, it's meant really to be, Sue, a desk reference, similar to the physician desk reference that all of us know about. But they're not for cover to cover, but to be there when you're trying to address an issue, think through a policy, think through the items that really help you sort of contemplate what options are out there for that I should be considering. It's been a fantastic opportunity to be a part of. So, but I am happy to have that in the rearview mirror instead of in my windshield right now.
Yeah, no kidding. I too have co-authored a book, and I know what you mean. And we have 2 manuscripts out there that we haven't gotten down to the publishing deadline, just because it is big work to get it from manuscript to final publication. So congratulations for doing that again and this most recent one. So thank you. This has just been a delightful conversation about the expertise that's in our corner to keep our healthcare environments safer and safer, even though risks might be rising. So thanks, Tony, for being here. And for all the listeners out there, please look at the show notes and see where you can connect with Tony, his company, his book. So thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Sue.
Thanks for tuning in to Culture Change RX. If you found value in today's episode and you are a believer in fostering change in healthcare, join us in making a difference. Follow, rate, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. Share it with colleagues and your network. Together, we can make a lasting impact. Until next week, keep inspiring positive change.